Everything you've been told about the Vikings is a lie. When you think of these Northmen, you probably picture blood-stained axes, massive wooden mead halls standing tall against the horizon, and warriors who thrived in the freezing cold as if they were made of ice themselves. But if you were to stand on the frozen coast of lawns or meadows in the year 1000, looking for the legendary hero Bjorn, you wouldn't see a wooden palace. In fact, you might not see anything at all until you were standing right on top of it. The image of the towering timber hall is a myth born of Hollywood, because the brutal reality of the North Atlantic, where trees were a luxury and the wind could strip the skin from your face, meant that to survive, you didn't build on the earth, you crawled inside it. Bjorn wasn't a god of war during the winter. He was a desperate architect of survival, digging into the frozen soil of the north to create a turf house, a living, breathing mound of dirt and grass that was the only thing standing between his family and a cold, lonely grave. Building a turf house wasn't just about stacking sod. It was a grueling, precision-based craft that took months of back-breaking labor before the first frost even touched the ground. Imagine Bjorn standing in a marshy bog, his hands cracked and bleeding, using a spade to cut stringer, long, thin strips of turf that had to be layered with the surgical precision of a modern bricklayer. You had to understand the roots, the soil density, and how the grass would knit together over time to create a waterproof seal. Because if you messed up the herringbone pattern of the peat blocks, the weight of the winter snow wouldn't just make the roof leak, it would cause the entire structure to collapse, crushing everyone inside while they slept. He had to source driftwood for the internal frame, a task that required scouring miles of coastline because there were no forests here, only the skeletal remains of trees washed up from distant lands. Every piece of wood was a treasure, used sparingly to create the landhouse or longhouse shape over which the thick walls of earth, sometimes 6 feet thick at the base, were piled. These walls weren't just insulation, they were a living ecosystem that breathed, trapping the heat of the earth and the bodies within, but they also held a terrifying secret that most history books ignore. As Bjorn finished the final layer of the roof, he knew he was sealing himself into a tomb of his own making, a place where the air would soon turn thick with smoke and the smell of damp earth, and where the silence of the coming snow hid a danger far more subtle than a Saxon blade. Do you think you could survive months in a house made of mud and grass while the world outside froze solid? Because as the sun began to set on the final day of autumn, Bjorn realized they hadn't brought enough fuel and the first blizzard was already screaming across the North Atlantic. By December, the world outside Bjorn's turf house in the Vatnajökull region had vanished under a shroud of white, leaving him and 15 others trapped in a space no larger than a modern living room. Life inside was a sensory nightmare that would break a modern mind within 48 hours. There were no windows, only a small leury or smoke hole in the roof that let in a ghostly grey light and a constant biting draft. The heat didn't come from a grand fireplace, but from a long, narrow lang elder in the center of the floor, fueled by precious peat and dried animal dung that filled the room with a heavy, acrid haze. You didn't just smell the fire, you smelled the damp wool of clothes that never truly dried, the pungent aroma of fermented shark and dried fish hanging from the rafters, and the unwashed bodies of humans and livestock huddled together for warmth. Bjorn spent his days in a perpetual twilight, sitting on the raised earthen pallur or benches that lined the walls, which served as his chair, his workbench, and his bed. The psychological toll was immense, as the winter madness was a very real threat when you were confined in a smoke-filled tunnel for 20 hours a day with people who were slowly starving. Bjorn's wife would spend her hours spinning wool by the flickering light of a fish oil lamp, a tiny guttering flame that cast dancing shadows against the dirt walls, making it seem like the land vatir or land spirits were encroaching on their small sanctuary. Food was a calculated gamble. Every bite of salted meat was a day closer to the bottom of the barrel, and if the sea ice blocked the coast, there would be no fresh fish to supplement their stores. They ate twice a day, a thick porridge or a stew of whatever was left, shared from communal bowls while they told stories to drown out the terrifying sound of the wind. That wind was a physical force, a relentless howling that shook the massive turf walls and reminded them that just a few inches of dirt were all that separated their warm blood from the killing frost. Bjorn would often lie awake at night listening to the rhythmic chewing of the sheep kept in the partitioned end of the house, realizing that if the animals died from the cold, the humans would soon follow, not just from hunger, but from the loss of the animal heat that kept the room temperature just barely above freezing. But as the great midwinter approached, a new sound began to emerge from the darkness. Not the wind, and not the animals, but a scratching from beneath the floorboards that suggested they weren't the only ones seeking refuge in the earth. The food was disappearing faster than it should have, and the tension between the men was reaching a breaking point, but what they found beneath the storage vats would change their understanding of the spirits in the house forever. As the calendar turned toward what we now call January, the turf house became a pressure cooker of human emotion and physical decay. Bjorn noticed the walls were starting to weep. Condensation from the breath of 20 people and animals was freezing into ice on the interior of the turf, creating a glittering but deadly dampness that seeped into their furs. This was the moment of greatest peril, where respiratory infections and trench foot could kill a man faster than a sword, and the lack of vitamin D left everyone's nerves frayed and their bodies aching. The mystery of the disappearing food was solved not by spirits, but by the grim reality of survival. They found that the youngest of the thralls had been eating the raw salted hides intended for repair, driven to madness by a hunger that no amount of storytelling could suppress. Bjorn had to make the hardest decision a leader can make: how to punish a man for a crime born of a desperation they all shared. They didn't have the luxury of anger, they only had the cold hard math of calories versus days remaining until the spring thaw. To keep the darkness at bay, they celebrated Yule, a desperate defined festival where they sacrificed the last of the fresh meat to the gods, praying for the return of the sun. It wasn't the joyous holiday we know today. It was a ritual of survival, a way to convince themselves that the sun had actually died. Bjorn would lead the chants, his voice hoarse from the smoke, staring at the small hole in the roof and waiting for that first thin sliver of golden light to hit the wall. When the thaw finally began in late March, the turf house didn't just melt, it became a swamp. The floor turned to mud and the living walls began to sprout fresh grass on the outside, while the inside smelled of rot and rebirth. As Bjorn finally pushed open the heavy wooden door, he wasn't the same man who had entered in October. He was thinner, his eyes were sunken, and his skin was stained with the soot of 5 months of fires. But he had survived. This was the true Viking legacy, not the raiding of Lindisfarne or the discovery of Vinland, but the sheer stubborn will to exist in a hole in the ground while the world tried to freeze them out. The turf house was a testament to human ingenuity, a blend of biology and architecture that allowed a seafaring people to become masters of the frozen earth. Today, the mounds at lands or meadows look like simple hills, but now you know the truth of what lies beneath that grass. It wasn't just dirt, it was a fortress of the soul. If you found this look into the real Viking life fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we are peeling back the layers of history to find the great beneath the gold.